Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you for
that. How many people are in the room, Robert?
Roughly 91.
Oh, fantastic. That's
I tried to change the camera perspective, but
that's okay. Look, that's fine. But hello, everyone. I just it's a little bit hard because I'm staring at the blank wall, but I'm glad there's 90 people who are here to talk about project options analysis and appraisal. The first thing I'd say is there were some slides that were circulated, I believe, by Robert, by the previous lecture on this. I reviewed those slides and I couldn't really improve on them, so I think you should have a look at those. They were really good explanations of some of the techniques, but my focus today is mainly looking at public sector projects. But I'm quite happy to talk about the techniques that were discussed in the other slides if people have questions. So I just thought I'd preface that. I'd also like to acknowledge today the traditional custodians of lands and waters throughout Victoria. The Auditor-General's Office is on a reconciliation journey, and we commissioned this painting here of Bunjil, the creator spirit of the Woiwurrung people. And I pay my respects today to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, their continuing culture, and to elders past and present, and also give my greetings to any Aboriginal or First Nations people we have in the audience today. It's a beautiful painting. It's actually on display in our lobby, and I love seeing it every day. So today what I'm going to do is cover some context about VAGO and our work. So VAGO is the Victorian Auditor-General's Office. I'm going to talk about some public sector projects that are out there right now for you to just get a sense of the scale and coverage. I'll talk about the project options analysis, which is, I suppose, the more meaty technical part of the presentation, and it builds on the slides that you've already got. A little more around evaluation of specific projects and costs and benefits. Some observations from me over my last 20 years looking at public sector project delivery. Some potential areas for improvement, and I guess some thoughts I have about project management techniques versus reality, and how we as project practitioners can better match our methods to the political rhetoric we hear every day around major projects. And of course, at the end, I'm available to have a conversation with anyone. I know it's a bit difficult because it's online, but I'm very happy to receive any questions. And I'll give you my email address at the end as well. So an important part about VAGO is that we are an independent office. We are really an adjunct to the Parliament. So we work quite independently of government. Sorry about that, should have put that on silent. We work quite independently of government, and we can't be directed in terms of the work we do. I mean, we have legislation that guarantees or that sets our mission and goals, but in terms of no minister or parliamentary committee can direct us to do certain audits in certain areas. So that's quite an important role we play. So we are quite specifically independent of the day-to-day. We're the auditor for all state entities, so any entity that is controlled by the Victorian state government or the Victorian government, and that usually means any entity that is established under Victorian law that is a public sector entity. And there's a wide variety, so it ranges from schools to hospitals. We audit the police, we audit local councils, we audit universities, including Melbourne University. We audit TAFEs and government departments and pretty much anything else that you can think of that is run by the public sector, by the Victorian public sector, we audit. We don't audit Commonwealth entities. So, for example, we don't audit, say, the Federal Police, or we don't audit Customs. We don't audit Services Australia, Centrelink type activities because that's a federal job. But there's a whole range. I think it's about 570 individual entities we audit every year. And our mandate has a number of separate functions. So one of our key functions is attest audit. And what that means is this is the financial statements audit, the typical audit that you think all auditors do, which is really around accounting and correct accounting. So we do that for every entity that has to report to Parliament. We provide the opinion on their statements, and we also provide a couple of opinions on the budget. So we do the annual financial report for the state of Victoria, and we also issue an audit opinion on the estimated financial statements, which is the budget. For some entities, we have to audit their statements of performance, and that's like KPIs. So that happens in water authorities and some councils where they're required to get an auditor's opinion. And the area I work in, we call direct engagement. So that is performance audit or performance audit type activities. So it's not always just an audit now. It's also known as assurance reviews, but they're very similar. And our focus is on economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and compliance with all applicable laws. That's actually in the legislation. That's our mandate. The reality, I guess, even though that is quite broad range, most of our focus is on efficiency and effectiveness, partly because economy is quite difficult to audit, mainly because economy is often based on circumstances at the time. And we also are moving into a bit more into the compliance space. But what we'll find is compliance tends to be linked to either efficiency or effectiveness anyway. So often we'll add an element of compliance to a particular review or audit we're doing. It's a bit about me. Sorry to scare you with that photo. My background there, so apart from being a young grandpa, youngish grandpa, that's 3 of my grandkids. There's 3 more in Sydney. I've been a performance auditor for about just over 22 years. I had about 3 years at the Australian National Audit Office, and I've now been at Vago for just over 19 years, which surprisingly has gone very fast. I don't know where the years went. I've also done some academic work. So I was a casual lecturer at RMIT in La Trobe, mainly in the project management space, but I'm not lecturing. I haven't been lecturing for about 5 years. I've been involved in the professional project management area as a board member of the Melbourne PMI chapter. I'm actually an alumnus of Melbourne. I did my Master of Public Infrastructure there, I don't know, 10 plus years ago, 15 years ago, I can't remember. But I'm actually, I'm actually one of a former student of the university. Previously to coming back to Victoria, I had some other roles in Canberra, Sydney and Darwin. I've worked in Vietnam. I did a BA in Asian Studies. That was my first degree. And I learned to speak Vietnamese in that degree, which I still speak. So I'm actually quite fluent in Vietnamese. So if there's any Vietnamese in the audience, xin chào các bạn. And I had 18 years in the Army Reserve, which was quite a long time ago. But there's a bit of a varied life experience there for you. This will give you a sense of the scale of projects underway in Victoria right now. So on the left-hand side, I've just taken a snip from the latest state capital program. So this is the budget papers. This is known as budget paper 4. But as you can see, we've had a massive leap in expenditure in public sector projects. Can everyone hear me okay, Robert?
Yes.
Yeah, great. And so we've seen since 2015-16, there was quite only about $5 billion per annum being spent on major projects. And now we're really accelerated to, 22 billion per annum. So that's year on year. So many projects go obviously over multiple years. So as you can see from the chart on the right-hand side, the aggregate is a lot higher than the individual expenditure. So we did, this is based on our own analysis, and it's slightly different from the numbers on the left, because the numbers on the left include all projects. So there's potentially about 1 to 2 billion in smaller projects. The chart on the right, as we say in the footnote there, it excludes any projects that are less than 100 million. So this is actually, this is taken from the report we put out in November last year called Major Projects Performance Review. And I'm actually restarting that for this year. So that's my current job. So I'll be working on this. I'll be doing the chart for 24-25 when we finally get some data together. So we've started collecting data and we're out there talking to agencies about their major projects. So this is, we've decided to run this again. So this will be the 4th year we've done the Major Projects Performance Review. But if you look to the chart on the right, you'll see for 23-24, there's been a little bit of a drop. So the peak year was 22-23, but quite a massive amount of money that is invested. And these are, it gives you a sense of the scale of activity. But a lot of the reason why it's dropped is because a lot of the existing projects have been completed. So you can see where they have picked up the slack on if you look at the 23-24 chart, the new projects that came in there were nearly just over 14 billion. So it's not a small amount of money that they're spending. But the size is about the same. So what we tend to see is there's about 128 major projects, 130. The expenditure, there's a lot of expenditure in programs of work, which are maintenance programs. They can be over 100 million. The water authorities spend a lot of money on ongoing maintenance and renewals. But we're mainly focusing in this chart on the right on specific standalone projects, so what you would describe as a project rather than a program of work. But it just gives you a sense Victoria is spending really big in the infrastructure and project space. So these are capital projects, of course. Not every project needs to be a capital project. There's projects that can be, internal projects or change projects. And I should also say it scopes out all technology projects, because the technology projects are reported separately in the Victorian Government ICT dashboard. So if you're interested in technology projects, that will give you a really good understanding of what's being spent in that space. What's the background of most of your students, Robert? Are they mainly in infrastructure type projects, or is it a bit of technology or a bit of both?
Yeah, it's a good question. So from our survey, we have a lot of engineers, civil engineers.
Yeah.
Some specializing. We had one specialization. What was the specialization of mechanical refrigeration systems, or if I got that correct? Yeah. But otherwise, we have as well a lot of engineering management and project management.
Okay, great. I mean, this is, as I said, this is just to give you a sense of the scale. It's not the complete picture, but it shows you just in the hard infrastructure or the hard, let's say, the construction projects. There's a massive amount of activity going on in Victoria right now. So just to give you some sense, and I'll be sharing those slides with Robert today, so he'll be able to circulate them. So no need to take screenshots and things like that. You'll get this material later. There's nothing secret in here. I went through the other slides and I thought they were really good. And what I wanted to do, I just took an extract from one of them because I thought it was quite useful. Because it sort of gives this concept of a life cycle of a typical project. And what I've put in the explanations or the breakouts is just explaining what in the typical literature, I think this was taken from the Green Book, which is a UK really useful, fantastic guidance, actually, the Green Book. in Victoria, we have slightly different language. So the strategic case is often called the business case in Victoria. And what you often find is that is developed by the department or the sponsoring agency with the minister and DTF, which is the Department of Treasury and Finance. So they are our treasury in Victoria. They get usually mainly involved from two aspects. One is understanding the potential cost and talking about what the availability might be of funding or whether there needs to be borrowings to fund that. So DTF has to get involved pretty early if it's going to be a major one. But they also have quite a lot of useful advice around structuring procurement processes. So the procurement strategy is usually done in conjunction with DTF, and that means things like, are we going to do an alliance? Are we going to do design and construct? Are we going to do a public-private partnership or PPP? So the DTF gets involved at that conceptual thinking. And what you'll find in the business case is those considerations around procurement model or approach to the project will also be considered. So business case can be a very detailed document, can be up to 500 pages. Part of my job is to read all those, and they're usually quite secret. They're usually sent to Cabinet and they're not available to the public. When they do become available to the public, they often redact large chunks of it so they don't give you the full picture. So it is quite a secretive process in many ways, and you often don't, even me now as the public sector auditor, I don't know what's gone to Cabinet, what went to Cabinet in December last year on the stage 1 process. I don't know what projects have been proposed. I don't know what's been approved. We won't find out usually until the budget papers, which come out in May when the Treasurer sets down his budget. So the second box there is called long list analysis. And really the equivalent we have now in Victoria is what's known as stage 1 budget, and that's a Cabinet process. So that's conducted by the Cabinet, and what they do there is they will sit down with all the bids that have come in that have cleared the initial hurdles and been supported by the ministers to go to Cabinet. So the departments write all this stuff up and then the minister still has to push them forward. So sometimes they won't get past the minister's office. So there's a little bit of ranking and sorting that occurs at the minister's office before it gets sent forward. And in that stage 1 budget process, the budget subcommittee will then, decide what their priorities are. Now, that's a political process. So public servants provide advice, but the decision-making is made by elected officials, by the ministers. And so at the end of the day, all a public servant can do is give their best possible advice, but the minister can ignore it and often does. And so, that's their right as the elected representative. So that's what the long list usually is. And from the long list, there will be quite a reduction in the proposals, and that becomes the short list. And that's known as Cabinet Stage 2. Usually by stage 2, they have a much better understanding of their financial position because they've collected 6 months worth of revenues, and they can work out what they can afford. And there is potential maybe for something that was knocked out in round 1 could get reintroduced in round 2 if there's funding. And then what happens is the preferred option is announced via the budget papers, and which is known as Budget Paper 4, which is a capital investment program. That's for capital projects. There's a lot of projects that are run internally, but they're not funded through the capital process. They're funded through the ongoing expenditure that they receive, or operational expenditure. And then throughout that, this concept of monitoring and evaluation is probably an area that is a bit weak in Victoria, particularly the evaluation component. There's quite a lot of monitoring, but we find as external auditors, there isn't a lot of final lessons learned or evaluative work done, to actually share lessons for the next project and maybe in a similar domain. So that's actually a live issue for us, and we talk about it quite a bit to departments. So we've got a couple of agencies. We've got DTF provide oversight, and that's usually a mixture of time and cost and time, cost, and scope. They will be looking at that and risk. So they are often also analysing risk in the project. They often have a red, amber, green. So if it's red, amber, or green, they provide that advice to cabinet. There's a process called gateway reviews, which is a set of reviews that are held at particular milestones for a project's life, and that's quite a useful process. But once again, that is a peer review process. So the report only goes to what's known as the senior responsible officer, so project director or the executive sponsor of that project. And so it doesn't necessarily get shared beyond the project team or even beyond the top 2 or 3 people in the project. So the value of that is potentially high. It might actually show a critical weakness, and if it's done early enough, then the project leadership can actually fix it. But it potentially is also too late by the time that is detected. And that's a bit of a criticism we have, even though we think the process is very worthy, because it uses peer experts and consultants to come in and provide a rapid review. We don't necessarily see that review then being used to drive improvement. And it often takes 6 months before anyone does anything about the recommendations. And the last one is VOGO. So we're in there. Obviously, we can't audit every single project. We try to get a landscape view, which is the current assurance review I'm on right now, which is major projects performance review. We try to understand across the board how the portfolio is going, but we can't necessarily go and audit every single item, every single decision, every single voucher or expenditure or invoice that goes in. It's beyond our capacity. And likewise, it's probably beyond the capacity of internal audit as well. So there's a lot going on in that, $120 billion space that we can't necessarily audit. So we have to focus our attention on the higher risk, higher materiality or higher value components of that portfolio. But we still have a role and we're in there. And, you would have seen, for example, we're looking at the Metro Tunnel. We've looked at Suburban Rail Loop. We look at major hospitals and other elements like that as we go. So what I've drawn out here are some thoughts about the specific elements that were in the slides that were circulated. And I've just broken it down into financial, environmental, and social. And this is based on my observation of how this actually works in the real world. And so from the financial side, I think it's probably the easiest to do. Well, when I say easiest, it's actually not easy. It's hard, but it's probably the most straightforward because it's just numbers at the end of the day. It's arithmetic and formulas. And so I see a lot of reliance on the financial in decision making, but not much understanding of how the numbers are actually derived. So I think what we usually see is cost benefit analysis, which is what the previous slides also pointed out, which is often called a CBA. And what that does, it uses known values or proxy values. So they take a baseline. So let's say we're going to extend a road or widen a road. We would go out there, we'd measure how much traffic goes through that road. You'd do it over a couple of different times of the day. You'd look at maybe different during the holidays, not during busy periods, and you'd try to get a baseline of how many people use that road. You might also want to understand when congestion is highest, and you might look at what the average speeds are of the traffic on that road. And so using all those have particular values. And if you may also want to look at what they call origin destination studies, but they're very difficult to do because you have to basically work out where that vehicle is going on its journey. There's ways to do it, but it's very hard on long road corridors because people are entering and exiting all the way through. So it tends to be mainly bulk usage. So what you would try to do then is derive, you may also use cameras to work out how many occupants are in each vehicle. And so you might end up getting an average, of 5% of vehicles have more than 3 passengers. You might want to segregate out light commercial and large trucks from commuter cars. So there's a couple of ways you would do that. And so you would need to spend a bit of time to understand that baseline. And then what you might do is start attributing values to each one of those types of vehicle. And you would attribute a value in terms of the time savings for that particular class of vehicle if they were able to travel at a faster speed. And there may be some other considerations such as stop-start traffic generates more pollution and emissions. So you might then say if we were able to calm the traffic or reduce stop-start, where people are belching out exhaust because they're constantly braking and stopping. And then there's other things like wear and tear on vehicles through congestion and stop-start can also be calculated. So there's a whole lot of values you can put together to actually work out the value of the current state. And then you can develop, based on what you think you need to achieve, you can then sort of forecast what a likely outcome might be in terms of smooth flowing traffic and how many savings there would be. So use those values to go into quite a complex economic model. And I've seen many, and sometimes they're like literally 175 embedded tabs with cross tabs and formulas. They're extremely complex. But what you're trying to do is allocate those values to what you've observed to develop what's known as a benefit cost ratio, or BCR. And that BCR is then expressed usually, even though it's called a ratio, they don't express it as a ratio, they express it as a number, so you might get, for example, a BCR of 2.5. And so what that means in shorthand is that's for every dollar you spend, you get $2.5 in benefit to the community. So it's not necessarily cash back, but you reduce emissions or you reduce congestion, you reduce wear and tear. So it's aggregated as a general benefit to the overall economy or community. So that's what, if you ever hear about benefit cost ratios or BCRs, that's what they are. Of course, it is a theoretical model in many ways because you're trying to forecast a potential future, and we don't always know what the future will bring. A lot of the economic models that were developed 10 years ago had no idea there was going to be a pandemic and we were going to see massive structural changes, say, for example, in public transport patronage, which has dropped 20% and not recovered yet. So even 4 years later, we're now still 20% below what we were in 2019. On a whole, I mean, it has recovered in some peak periods. So one important thing to try and do is do some sensitivity testing around these BCRs. And there's a couple of ways to do it. So one is to just say a high, medium, and low confidence, known as the Goldilocks approach. Porridge is too hot, porridge is too cold, porridge is just right. Everyone tends to like the just right, but you need to sort of look at the left and right. Or another one is to do some, there's actually two more ways. One is to do what's known as a Monte Carlo analysis, which is a randomized stochastic analysis, which is basically to generate a bunch of random outcomes and then plot them in some sort of bell curve so you can work out what your likelihood is of distribution. Once again, it's entirely theoretical. It's just playing with numbers, but it does help you understand that in a potential 100 random situations, where would your likelihood fall? And the last one, which is sort of interesting, is you can actually do scenario-based. So they could be more politico-economical. Like you might have a scenario that says economic downturn plus, population growth, or population loss plus economic, So you can actually start looking at those more higher level demographic super trends, which is often called scenario testing rather than sensitivity testing. Sensitivity testing tends to be more around numbers. Scenario testing is the big picture, what could happen demographically, war with China, all those sort of things, crazy stuff. But no one thought there'd be a war in Europe, 5 years ago. So, and we can all see the impacts that's had across the global economy. So that's the financial, and the other one that I've had a bit of exposure to is environmental. I think what's important for both the private sector and the public sector is that environmental appraisals are very formal, and they're usually requirements under legislation. And often there's multiple pieces of legislation. So you might have federal legislation, you might have state legislation, and you may even have local government requirements. And so I think a lot of people forget that you can't just do a project without getting those environmental sign-offs. And I've seen a lot of large projects, they've actually done a really good job on this. And I know for the Metro Tunnel and the Suburban Rail Loop and even Westgate Tunnel, they did quite substantial pieces of work around their environmental impact statement. Like literally millions of dollars spent on specialised consultants and thousands of pages and hundreds of hours of meetings with, hearings and panel meetings with specialists. The outcome of all that is that a whole lot of environmental controls or environmental performance indicators are set up. And what that helps to do is give the project, once it passes the EIS, it also sets the boundaries in terms of what is tolerable for the impact it can have on the environment. If I give an example of Metro Tunnel, they had, very close, not so much near Melbourne Uni, but at CBD North or State Library, there was a brewery there, Carlton United Brewery, and that had hundreds of, well, not hundreds, but, decades and decades of previous industrial usages, all that land to the north of. And over time, there had been seepage of particular chemicals into the substrata, and that plume was slowly migrating southwards across Victoria Street, if you know that area, up to the north of Swanston Street. And so because the Metro Tunnel was proposing to dig a massive cavern internally and some large shafts to access that cavern, that of course would have that would attract that water or that contaminated subsurface water into the void, because water seeks a void. And because so they had to do quite a lot of work. So if you've ever driven between the Victoria Market and RMIT, you'll feel on the northern side there's quite a lot of bumps as you go down that lane, because they have these very large capture wells where they actually try and capture that water, that contaminated water, before it can go near the construction site. Now, that was mainly a problem when it was a raw excavation, but now that the actual tunnel is waterproofed and tanked and all the concrete is in place, it's less of a problem, because all can really happen is it might migrate to the concrete and it will stay there like any other surface water. And so, but they had to be aware of that issue, and they had to put a lot of controls in during both construction and also during planning to try to intercept it if they could, and then put in place, particular treatments otherwise. So that just gives you an example of one particular problem, which was a historical problem and actually was not the state's fault that that contamination existed. But the state, because it was building that facility, had to put in measures to stop that contamination from coming into a site. And another example would be hydrology. The entryway of the metro tunnel is the entryway to Metro Tunnel is actually at Flemington, so South Kensington, and there's a known floodway there, and that floodway is. Sorry, I just have to turn off my notifications because I'm getting pinged. Sorry, that's good. Hold on. Sorry. And sorry, I've just lost my place by moving out of that thing. I think I'm back. Can you still see my screen? Is it showing? Is my screen still showing, Robert? Yep. I think you're on mute.
Yep. We have your slide, and you were talking about the South Kensington.
Yeah, that's right. And so at South Kensington, the decline structure that runs from the existing rail line into the tunnel enters a flood zone. And if you go down to South Kensington, you'll see they've had to put quite a large wall in along that entryway. And recently, I don't know, there was a big flood just in recent years. And that flood has actually made them rethink whether the original EIS was sufficient. And so they're actually going to have to raise the wall by another 1.5 metres, which was not in the original EIS. So with the big floods we had in Maribyrnong and Essendon a few years ago, and there was a lot of controversy around whether Flemington Racecourse had triggered that. And so that's in the vicinity of that. And so now there's a real question mark, particularly with global warming and concerns about more intense rainfall. So they've actually decided they're going to raise that wall. So they're going to go across and actually build on new panels to provide better flood protection. Because if floodwaters get into that decline, it will flood the Metro Tunnel, which is pretty bad. You don't really want that to happen. Like in New York, when they had the Frankenstorm, it basically flooded something like half the metro because most of the water went in via stations or in their portals into their declines. So environment is very important, and I'll talk a bit about it later on. The other one is social. Now, social is really interesting because it's not specifically required. There are some considerations of social issues actually in the environmental impact statement. They usually consider Aboriginal heritage and other heritage issues, which are sort of partly social. But the whole question about social comes down to how do we appraise this? Is this about seeking community views, or is this about actually just demonstrating we've understood the impacts on the community? And so there's a little bit of a separation of those two. But I think what I'm seeing more and more is that there's quite a lot of focus now on community interaction and community outreach, particularly on projects that will cause disruption in a community. And the example I can give there is that level crossing removals, they conduct extensive community interaction on their projects. They localise the interaction, usually, it's a focus on a particular railway station. It's focused on maybe 2 level crossings in the vicinity. There's usually shopkeepers and regular travellers and who will be disrupted, and like their station might be shut for 6 months and they'll have to get a bus and they'll have to do this and that. I mean, it's happening right now in parts of I think Croydon and Parkdale and maybe another station, Keon Park, are all being demolished right now. So I'm sure anyone, if you use those stations, you're probably a bit annoyed having to catch a bus instead. But that's a big part of what they do now, is actually talk people through the staging, the concept designs. So they put a lot of effort and time into that. And that's well before, the project commences. Let's just go to the next slide. So when we go to a more detailed evaluation of projects for the costs and benefits, as I said, please refer to the previously distributed slides. And that gives some really good examples of how to do an appraisal. As I said, I couldn't improve on those, so I thought I may as well just refer them back to you to look at. I think they're all quite very useful and very well described. I think from the perspective of public projects, nearly all public capital projects, and when I say all, anything say over 5 million or perhaps over 10 million these days, would have some sort of socio-economic appraisal done. And usually the economic appraisal will try to include some elements of the social. That's why I've specifically said socio-economic, because they tend to link the social outcomes in there. It's done as part of a business case, and that has a format set by Department of Treasury and Financial, DTF, in its investment lifecycle guidance. I've just given you the link there. It's quite useful guidance, and they do set some model approaches from a whole bunch of different things: procurement strategy, options analysis, everything. It's a really comprehensive. I use this guidance when I'm assessing a business case. So I will use their guidance, then go back in and say, did you actually meet their guidance? And then we will do our own assessment, for example, of the quality of the work they did. So we're not saying, did you? It's a bit like a uni assignment. You can fill in the headings, but how good's the work, So it's one thing to have the headings, another thing to actually do the individual research and the analysis beyond that. So that's usually the more difficult part of what we do. But the fact that agencies are now following this, and I'm seeing pleasingly a lot of much better, a more comprehensive approach to doing this. And now we're moving ourselves away from the baseline compliance, which is, do you have a business case, which used to be a question. Many didn't have business. They were just going to cabinet with submissions, which is give us money, we're going to build something. To now to actually writing business cases. And now the question for us now is, how good is that business case? And so we actually did a big review last year called The Quality. We looked at the quality of some business cases, and that was a specific focus for us. Was not so much the format, even though that is expected. We were looking at how good is the material they're producing. I think what we also have to realise is that the appraisal work can be complex and expensive. And the public sector usually relies on specialists or consultants, but they can use often, particularly in transport projects and sometimes more and more in health projects. They can use industry-approved indices, which are sort of it's a bit like how quantity surveyors will use indices to work out, cost of concrete and gravel and how many cubic meters per wall. So these days you can get pretty good values around what's the value of a laden truck on a metropolitan journey in terms of its economic value, in terms of what it's bringing to market or what activity it's conducting. What sort of emissions is it giving out? What sort of operating costs does it have? So you can get quite useful. And there's a couple of organisations now. I think the Roads Association of Australia now has a bunch of indices. So what we would be looking for is something where you can get indices. We would be asking the department to show us, whether they've used them, because they're sort of best practice. And also we'd be looking at how they've used them, because there's also guidance about how to use an indices, how to use a particular value and not. One of the values that often comes up in public transport is, which is a bit different from road, is they talk a lot about elasticity effect, which is like the impact of lower fares or higher fares on the likelihood to travel. And so there is a little bit of variance in terms of how people, what indices are used. And the indices are quite complex because they're based on the type of metropolitan environment you're in. So do you use a European indice or an American indice or a Japanese indice? Because each economy will use public transport in a different way. And so that can be quite a complex exercise to work out what set of values should be used. But hence probably why there's a lot of specialists and consultants used, because most public servants probably wouldn't have that experience. So that's an observation I'm making, that it can be quite complex. But putting aside that, which is important to do, an investment logic map, which I think is the exercise you're going to do after this, that's why I thought I'd bring it up, because it is a really useful tool, is a really good way to crystallize, with stakeholders, what you're trying to get out of this project, particularly in the early concept phases when you're designing or envisioning that particular project. And here's one I prepared earlier. This is not mine. This is just stolen from DTF's book. But what this gives you is an idea of how you can conceptualize. And this is, let's say this is before you start doing the hard edge work around EIS and economic appraisal. This is really when you're thinking, what can this project do? Why are we doing this? And so what we sort of start with is, from the left, the drivers is really a problem definition. What are we trying to solve? What's the issue? And so what they've done there is, this is a fictional scenario, but what they've done there is they've actually talked about how they see the problems, and then they've weighted the problems. And there's usually this is not a lot of science involved in this weighting. It's usually done through workshop. But in some cases, depending on the particular context of the project, you can actually bring some really good evidence to decide that weighting. The objectives, now those objectives, once again, there's not a lot of science in those, but you can use you could have, say, the government's policy of the day. You could have the department's own mission or legislative responsibilities. So there's a number of different ways you can think about what are we trying to achieve, and how do we want to do that, and which leads to, what benefits do we want to focus on. It's quite interesting that benefits are in the middle, because that's exactly where I think they should be. However, I don't see the benefits staying in the middle, and I'll talk about that a bit later in the presentation. But what this shows you is, okay, we've thought about the problem, we've understood, our objective. What do we want to try and achieve, and is this in line with our mission? What's the objective of this intervention or this investment? And then the benefits are, what are we going to get out of this? And in this case, they've weighted their benefits. They've got 3 benefits. They believe they can achieve these benefits, or they are the benefits they want to achieve. And then to the right of that is changes. The old model used to say interventions, but changes is probably a less aggressive word. So this is saying, what change do we want to achieve with this project? We all know the definition of a project. It's like a change state or a new asset or something along those lines. So a project is about concretizing change. We're trying to actually achieve something different than what the status quo is. That's why we do projects, to make different things happen. So in many ways, what that change is saying, what are we going to do with this project? What is this project going to deliver? But what's really important, the delivery has to be linked to the benefits. And so what we see there is that really, with no benefits, then the delivery has no meaning. That's what I would argue. And unfortunately, what I see is that too many project scope or project deliverables become disconnected from the benefits that were driving the original investment decision in the first place. So I think what we can see there is how they've linked those benefits. And once again, the weighting on the benefits can be quite subjective. and that's usually workshopped. But it's still important to to at least understand how your project deliverables. If you end up with a project deliverable that doesn't link to any of these benefits, I would say you may have to rethink whether you've missed out on a benefit or whether you actually need to do that part of the project. Like, unless you can see anything, any linkage, it's probably something that you could de-scope or value engineer away from what you're trying to deliver. The last column is around enablers, and what these are items that need to happen perhaps before you can achieve the changes. So you might need to make legislative changes, or you might need to do a precursor project, or you might need to do some land acquisition. There's a whole lot of stuff. So they've identified very vague ones there, but they could be, those enablers could be a lot more specific. And so that you can actually implement the change state to then implement the benefits. So that's just an example of where in the appraisal options development phase, an investment logic map can really crystallize your thinking about why am I doing this project and what's it for and what am I trying to achieve out of it. I really, in case you didn't notice, I really like investment logic maps. I think they're really good. And I look for them as well when I'm doing my audits. It's one of the first things I want to see. The business case is just guff. It's all just matrices and, numbers. I'd rather see this because this is sort of the thinking, the high level thinking about your project, the strategy. I'm not that old, but I'm pretty old, so I can afford to have 20-year backward observations now. So I'm in my mid-50s would be the way to describe it. Middle-aged. By the time I'm 90, I'm hoping the lifespan will be about 105. So I'm 110 at least. So I'm halfway through my life now, at least. I'm not quite grown up. Lifespan for men seems to be going up about 5 years every 3, so that's not too bad. I might catch up. But my observations are, having looked at these projects for quite a long time, I think early community engagement on the high level concepts is really useful. When I say high level concepts, I'm thinking about just sort of master plans, possible route corridors, conceptual ideas about where a new hospital might go or need to go. And getting the community to start talking about what they want to see. I think it's useful because it gets the community thinking about their future and gives them a sense of ownership of a piece of public infrastructure that, is not being imposed upon them. They're co-designing it. But I think it also helps the departments or the sponsoring agencies to become more sensitized to the depth and intensity of the community wants and needs. So the community might, for example, have a real focus. Let's use the example of a new hospital in Melton. I know it's been approved, but the community there might have a real focus on a really good maternity wing, and they're less concerned about orthopedics, hip replacements and geriatric services because the demographic there is young. And maybe they want a good accident and emergency department because people crashing their cars in the local area or people falling off their ladders and they're doing renovations. So that might be, and the department itself maybe didn't think about that. They said, you're going to get 10 birthing suites, you're going to get this, you're going to get that, because that's what they do in every general hospital. They said, this is the size of the hospital. And so the community themselves may have a very good idea about what they want that hospital to provide. Because in many ways, the service plan for the hospital will drive the actual architectural plan for the hospital. So if you're going to have a hospital that is mainly focused on outpatient clinics, you're not going to need to have as much ward space or operating theatres. But if you're going to have a big emergency department, you will need lots of operating theatres and pathology and imagery because they are very hungry users of that. And so then suddenly the size and the shape of your hospital changes based on what the community wants. And then that could be tested against data, and the community might believe they need more maternity, but actually it's shown the birth rate isn't actually higher than anywhere else in Melbourne. And maybe a respectful conversation could occur between the sponsor and the community to say, actually, we did the numbers and you guys aren't having more babies than what you think you are. It's just that you don't have a hospital nearby, and so that's why you perceive that you're missing out on this and you need more. So I think that's a very useful engagement that could occur. And I'm seeing pleasant signs that it is occurring a bit more. I think doing these benchmark scoping exercises is really important. And we often don't see enough of that. And one of the things, I guess, there's a lot of money thrown at projects, particularly in the planning phase. A lot of money gets spent on consultants and economic people, but not much gets spent on designers and engineers to come and actually do, some sort of paper project, to actually do a concept project and test it, and even to get quantity surveyors in early to say, well, look at this general outline concept. What would a typical cost plan look like? And what if we build a structure like this? What would it likely cost? So I think those activities are really important, and I've seen a couple of good examples of it, but I think that could happen a little bit more. Just adding on to community outreach, I think it does take time and it needs to be authentic. So if the community gets a whiff that a decision's been made already and they're just getting post-consulted, they will be really annoyed. I think it has to be done with a commitment to actually take the feedback to decision makers, even if they don't agree with the community saying, and it may come back and say, we're not going to do this that you want. I think it has to be an authentic engagement. This goes back to my earlier point about environmental approvals. They can take a really long time, like 18 months. And they do need high quality work done by quite specialised people, such as fauna studies. Fauna studies, particularly if you're going to a greenfields area, can be really expensive. You have to send naturalists out there to capture butterflies and lizards, and they have to observe, stuff in different seasons and work out where the birds are nesting. That can take 12 months. You might pay, $3 million for a fauna study, Hydrology is one. Seems to be underdone because we're a pretty dry climate, but we seem to be getting lots of floods because we're getting lots of rain. And just understanding floodplains and likelihood of where floodwaters would go when there is unexpected, intense rainfall is becoming really important. Heritage is probably less of an issue in Australia than, say, Europe, where there's thousands of years of built infrastructure. But our heritage in Australia, our thousands of year heritage is for a different cultural context. It's around Aboriginal heritage. And Aboriginal heritage is sometimes not linked to buildings. It's linked to sacred sites or historical meeting areas. And often the only, let's say the only remnants of that is maybe tools or middens or other types of artifacts that are left behind. I think there's more sense of people getting sensitized to understanding that just because European settlement came and built a farm here, it doesn't mean an Aboriginal site was extinguished, and that we need to, and then we've bought that farm up and then we're going to put a railway line through it. That doesn't mean that Aboriginal site is still no longer there either. And so it's about understanding that European settlement may have removed the Aboriginals from the landscape, but it hasn't removed the Aboriginal heritage from the landscape. And I think what we need to be understanding a lot more is that heritage isn't just like fancy buildings built in the 1830s. It's also, things that might have been used 3,000 years ago. And the last one there is around land use and contamination. I think we have pretty patchy records for previous land use. And perversely, the patchiness can be really bad, particularly on state sites. The state doesn't keep good records of where it dumped its medical waste or asbestos or poured diesel into the ground. So we do have potentially quite high risk of contamination in some sites. And that does require a lot of testing. And I talked about contamination at Carlton, but if we look at the Fitzroy Gasworks site, I mean, that's had to be totally remediated. That was a state-run gas and fuel big gasometer that was there. The gasometer was demolished many years ago, but all the hydrocarbons from that gas plant are seeped into the ground, which meant the ground basically needed to be drilled and irrigated, and all that contaminated water had to be brought out of there and burnt. So that was extremely expensive. I think 60 million just to remediate the site. But there's no other option because you can't put, public housing or schools on there if you haven't removed those toxins. Likewise, the Commonwealth Games Athletes Village, which was built in Parkville, now known as Parkville Gardens, that was using an old mental hospital, Mont Park, I think it was called. And that hospital was full of asbestos in its internal, piping. They had been burying their medical waste in a pit which was unmarked, and they had just covered it with soil. So that pit was discovered during excavation, and so suddenly luckily it wasn't anything gory like body parts, but it was still, obviously medical waste. So that had to be removed, remediated, taken to an incinerator. And then they also found that a creek line on the property had been filled in with scrap bitumen by the Country Roads Board when they built the Tullamarine Freeway, which no one realised. And that was going to be a wetlands component. So they had to dig out all the old leftover bitumen and other waste from the road builders when they built which is now CityLink, but that freeway through there was a state freeway, so the state just dumped its waste on state land, So, and then when they tried to remediate the whole thing and sell it off to the private sector, they had to get rid of all that. So it just shows you, you cover it up for this generation, you pay for it in the next. It's a bit like global warming, isn't it? I mean, we're covering it up a bit now, but we'll be paying in the future to get rid of it. So contamination is a big issue, particularly on brownfield sites. And so good survey work. I also think there's an over-reliance on consultants to do economic appraisals. I understand the pragmatic reality as to why it occurs, and mainly it's because private sector people have the skills and availability. Public sector economists are far and few between. We don't really hire people as economists anymore. We don't have enough work to sustain it. So the skills that a public sector economically trained person might have may perish if they're not used consistently. And then the private sector, of course, they keep them busy, so they're constantly doing this. But I do think there's a degree of over-reliance around understanding how these models are constructed and also being able to intelligently critique them. And I fear that the state doesn't fully understand the models they rely upon when they're quoting cost savings or time savings. And definitely ministers don't understand, the time value of money or any of those other types of concepts when they're quoting, 25-minute time saving for a student in Frankston going to Monash and Suburban Roll Loop was like, what scenario was that? That doesn't explain why the project overall stacks up. That's like you're picking one fact out and trying to extrapolate it to a $30 billion project. I don't think so. That 25-minute saving will not add up to 35 billion, I can tell you now. But that was in a press release just last week, by the minister. So it does show you that they will cherry pick these things with no understanding of how those numbers are used to actually build the model or what impact that particular number has on the overall model. it's trying to understand that, how the model interacts as well can be, very complex. And one thing that I've observed, and it goes back to these benchmark projects, is a front end engineering feed, as it's often called, or front end engineering design, is, in my view, never wasted, um, uh, especially for novel and complex projects. So the Metro Tunnel, for example, they had a whole project done, really. They had working designs well before they had engaged with the market, because they needed one to do the EIS. So they needed to show conceptually how the project would work and where they would locate key equipment and tunnel boxes and escape shafts and everything. Because unless they had that, they couldn't complete the EIS. They had to show where the cross passages would be. And so they had to pay a lot of money to get that done. They had to get an engineering firm in. But that engineering firm that they used was able to then help them as a proof engineer. So they did the initial designs, but when the private sector came in and then the private sector gave them their designs, they could then convert that engineering firm that was supporting them into helping them provide engineering scrutiny over the private sector consortia's designs. So I think that was quite inspired. It's very expensive. I mean, but for a $12.8 billion project, you spend 90 million on a engineering firm who's going to provide you all those services. It does feel like a lot of money, but on the other hand, they potentially might have saved them a lot of money too through, avoiding mistakes. And second last slide, sorry, am I on time? So I think when I think about the possible areas for improvement, I think on the economic side, there could be more peer review and or community or public examination of assumptions and models. There's a famous professor in the UK called Professor Bent Flievberg, and he has written a lot about mega projects and risk. And, he has a view that the main reasons why projects go over time, over budget, is due to, well, he says there's two components. First one he thinks is delusion. So everyone becomes delusional about a project because they're so excited and they want to achieve it. They can't see, it's called optimism bias. They believe it's much easier to achieve. He calls that delusion, and he calls it deception. The next part is deception, where he feels that the numbers that are put to decision makers are always the rosy numbers, the Goldilocks numbers, the one in the middle. And the risks are downplayed. And that's a little bit of a mixture of delusion, but it's also a bit of game playing to get the project started. And once that project started and the ministers signed off on it, it's very difficult for a minister to cancel, particularly an infrastructure project. There's a big hole in the ground. They're not going to wear that politically. So they have to then forge ahead and cough up more money to pay for the variations. So I think peer review will help to smoke a bit of that game playing out. I think that base case economic models need to be reset after there's any major scope changes. I don't see any evidence of that occurring at the moment. So I think perversely we continue going down a track, even though we've extinguished all the benefits and we're now spending 120% more than we expected, pretending that the project is the same project. That's a different project. That's not the same project. But we don't reset any of the economic stuff after that. Sorry for my typo. We should use better practice outreach models that maximise input and buy-in by the community. I said this a bit earlier. We should make it frank and authentic, rather than just managing the community to accept a preferred approach. So usually there is a preferred approach in the department, but it's often really brave to say, okay, that might be our approach. Let's hear what the community thinks, and to be willing to actually consider changes. On the environmental side, I think overall there needs to be better research and data to better understand potential impacts and also existing conditions. And I think we should be, sorry, I made a typo there. It's not economic outcomes. It should be environmental outcomes. So we should be using the EIS to maximise environmental outcomes, even if we do end up with some temporary or isolated environmental degradation. And some of the ways you can do that is through offsetting. So, for example, if you need to cut down trees here, you replant trees over there. You may not ever be able to replant them in that particular location where you cut them down, but you got to make sure that at least the trees you removed are replaced. Or you could conduct rehabilitation of another site. So, for example, if you go through an area that is quite, maybe a public space that was used for recreation, you should rehabilitate either parklands or other areas and bring it up to the standard of the previous space that you're now going to take over and change. And we are seeing quite a bit of that with community focused infrastructure. Westgate Tunnel spent a lot of money rebuilding community pavilions and ovals in the corridor. And I know that there's been, with the North East Link, there's been a pledge that for every tree they cut down, they're going to plant 3 more. I don't know where they're going to plant them, but and they probably won't be as mature as the ones they cut down, but they're at least going to do that. And I guess, in the long run, replacing that tree cover will be important and useful. But of course, it doesn't stop that initial damage, from that habitat from being removed. So I'll fix that slide when I send it out. Now, this is once again my thoughts, which I'm sharing with you. I'm pretty happy to share them, but maybe don't send them to the Premier. I think one of the challenges we face is that we're all brought up in this paradigm as project managers where it's all orderly and, we make decisions that are based on facts and links and then we do end-to-ends and start-to-starts and, we make it all look like it's all science and that there's a rational process behind everything. And in the private sector, yes, maybe. Because return on investment is often what drives projects and it's mainly what drives projects. So no private sector company does a project that's not going to make any money out of. And that's expressed as dollars or profit. And that drives a discipline in your project planning. So if you don't achieve that profit, you're done. The project gets cancelled. So the private sector is pretty much driven by the dollar, which is what their nature is. I'm not criticising that. It's just the way it is. However, in the public sector, we have a different paradigm. So we have political perceptions by MPs or decision makers, which often drives their view about the soundness of a project and how it will aid their re-election. Most MPs, the focus of an MP is to get re-elected. I'm not saying that in a nasty way. That's the nature of their job. They're elected by the people. They want to do things for the people that will make them get re-elected so they can keep representing the people. That's the driver of that's the fundamental driver of the relationship. They believe they're a good representative of the people. So, so they obviously want to do things that the people want wherever possible. So that focus on re-election is also a focus on what the citizens or the people want. And that's more like what I would call political ROI or PROI. But then the other part about public projects is most of them and just about all of them, they can't return cash to the state's bottom line. Very rarely will a project generate a profit for the state. And even then, all they're generating is likely to state as, if we think of CityLink or, Transurban makes squillions out of it. But every time they look like they're going to make a massive profit, they go and help the government build more tunnels or extra lanes so that they don't have to actually pay the state in cash. Because by building those extra lanes and extending their concession and all the other things that they've done, they will, of course, generate more profit because they control the road and the tolls will come to them and there'll be more people on the roads and blah, blah, blah. It becomes the state is changing that toll road model from North East Link. The state will be the toll collector. But the state only did it to de-risk the project because there was a lot of market concern about whether there would be enough people to make it to stack up, and people didn't. The private sector builders didn't want to take on market risk of the tolls, and so the state ended up taking on the market risk. Now, there's no guarantee that the state will collect enough tolls to pay off the the cost of building the facility. And of course, there's always that political angle, which is if a populist government gets in and says we're getting rid of the tolls, well, stroke of a pen, the tolls will go, like New South Wales or whatever. But then, of course, the rest of the budget still has to pay the contract to maintain those tunnels. So it just means that taxes will increase somewhere else, or the state will have to cut services to fund that. So tolls, I guess, are one way to make sure its user pays, but it doesn't make a profit is probably the important thing I'd say. And that's mainly because most public sector projects are an enabler of some sort of public service delivery. And their fundamental value is based on amenity to the community. So, the hospital, the school, or prison sort of amenity. It's an amenity for us who aren't offenders, but it's probably not an amenity for offenders. They're probably saying, why did you build this on my behalf? But I guess we're very happy that perhaps they're not living amongst us and stealing our cars or whatever. But it is basically an amenity. And so what I think of that is it like a social capital ROI by building public infrastructure? Are we actually increasing our capacity as a society to function? So it's a very different pattern of thinking. And so when we think about these two quite different universes for project appraisals, how do we unify that view, as project management professionals? How do we make sure our project management techniques don't become totally politicized, but also don't become, ignore the reality that we're not trying to make money for the boss either, so it's a bit like we have to live in this middle space. And so what I think is a way to resolve that is that we need to have a focus on defining and delivering the expected benefits throughout the life cycle, which is, one key way we could bring discipline and rationality to public sector project delivery. So that way we don't need to get too focused on ROI. We just focus on benefits. And in effect, the benefit in a private sector company is the ROI anyway, or return on capital. So, or internal rate of return. So we don't need to worry too much about that in the public sector because we're trying to deliver facilities that can deliver services. But if we don't focus on the benefits, we could end up, doggedly pursuing parts of projects that we don't need to do, or that we need to focus on that we're not actually delivering the expected thing, and we do need to refocus our efforts around that. So that's probably, I think that's my concluding thought there around, the difference between public sector and private sector. And I'll just summarise for you there. Just let you read that slide, but in essence, what I'm saying is that public project appraisal can be more challenging than private sector, as it's not just money at stake. And I've got some ideas there. Do your homework, involve the community, maintain focus on the benefits. The last one I'd say is don't forget, and this is more a call out to, if you ever get to work on a public sector project, you're spending someone else's money. It's taxpayers' money. That's an important thing to remember. And particularly, it is a finite pool. There's no magic pudding where money just keeps appearing, even though it did feel like it for 20 years. Now it's getting tight. And what it really means is that $1 wasted on a project can't be used in another area of public service delivery. So if you lose 50 million on a project, through waste, that's 50 million can't be spent on teachers, nurses, doctors, police, child protection practitioners, potholes being fixed on roads. I mean, it's just gone. Once it's wasted, it's gone. It's gone into the pockets of a construction company, and then it's gone into a shareholder's pocket, and potentially off to China or Spain or wherever the parent owner is. So all you've done is buy someone another Lamborghini at the end of the day when you're wasting money on public projects. And so that's part of my job, I guess, is to try to minimise that waste and make sure that the public sector is incentivised to do their best and deliver the best benefits at the best cost. Sometimes cost increases can't be avoided, but you shouldn't just hand money to the private sector because you're lazy. You should make sure that there is a real reason why a variation needs to be approved, and that it was unforeseen, and no one could have predicted it would occur. So I might stop there. That's my contact details. I'll just fix up that slide for Robert and circulate it this afternoon, and I'll have my details on there. Happy to take any questions now, or if you wanted to follow up via an email. Not sure how we're going to do this. Maybe if you turn the computer, can you turn the computer around?
Yeah, that was probably the idea from the beginning. I should have done this.
It's okay.
I will disconnect now, everyone. This is
I'll stop sharing the slides.
Yeah, can I say first, thank you very much, and can we thank Paul altogether for his talk?
Hi everyone. Now I can see your faces. How you going? Was it boring?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Yeah, maybe, do you have any questions for Paul?
Yeah.
We have gone through quite a bit, but yeah, please.
Okay, so I'm interested with the statement that we don't need to care for the ROI for the public project. Meanwhile, the public project is also funded by money. I mean, schools
Let me repeat this a little bit. Oh, can you hear that okay, Paul?
Yeah, I heard that. Yep.
Yeah, okay, go on.
Okay, so could we just convert the benefit of the social benefit, environmental benefit, and etc. related with the public sector project into ROI or ERR? Is it possible, or so we will still care on the ROI for the public project by converting the social benefit to the amount of money to be calculated in the ROI?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So look, there's two ways to think about it. I'm not saying you shouldn't focus on ROI, but I just don't think financial return is necessarily the right measure for a public sector project. And when we're doing an economic appraisal, we're not just looking at dollars, and as I said, it's very rarely the case where a public project will deliver a cash benefit to the government. Even with our what we call economic infrastructure in Victoria, our toll roads, for example, our public transport system, the toll roads, it mainly goes to private sector parties. That revenue doesn't go to the state. And public transport is extremely subsidised. Like we spend the amount you pay on your Myki only covers 20% of the operating costs of public transport. So 80% of that is funded by the state. So whenever, so there's really no opportunity, I think, in Victoria to use a financial ROI. No public project would get funded because it just wouldn't stack up. So that's why I think when you're thinking about an economic appraisal, you have to have a holistic view. So you have to consider, cost, or economic is a consideration of all elements anyway. It's not just cash. Social and environmental. You have to think of all those things together as part of your, as I call it, a social capital ROI. If you look at that bottom dot point there, where a public sector project is designed to provide a service or an amenity to the public. It's not designed to make a profit for the government. And maybe in some countries, maybe that's different, but I know definitely in Australia, our focus in public sector projects is to maximise the service rather than maximise the return to the state. The state has privatised just about all its economic infrastructure. Like we don't run the electricity system, for example. The state got out of electricity, but the state still runs water. It doesn't run gas anymore. We used to run gas. But the state runs water, but it's highly regulated and it's designed to only charge consumers, you know, a reasonable cost. So there's no profit margin in water, for example. So, you know, and a lot of, I mean, water is self-funding, like water infrastructure. But on the other hand, hospitals are not self-funding. We would never build a hospital based on ROI, just on financial terms only. Did that help answer that question? Was that helpful? No problem.
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, in industry, we have as well the IRR or internal rate of return, right? Or yeah, even with the net present value. I remember that if you have certain resources, you can nearly use it as a benchmark, right? To look what you could have done better with the resources. Is that something that is of interest, or could that appear in that space?
What's interesting, because I've often seen business cases, say for technology projects, which are proposing, you know, automation and, you know, streamlining of manual processes. You know, and in the private sector, there's a big focus on reducing headcount. You know, you invest in technology to get rid of staff. That's the fundamental reason why companies buy technology. They don't want to employ people. They'd rather have machines. You know, I mean, that sounds very blunt, but that is the driver. So just about every major technology vendor is selling its services to a company to reduce staffing. And so they write that when they bid to the state as well, and they say, oh, you know, you could get a headcount reduction in this part of your department of up to 10 or 15%.
Yeah.
What the private sector, I guess, the private sector vendor doesn't understand is that the public sector system is a ration system. It's already oversubscribed usually. So if you release 10% of your staff from mundane duties through automation, those staff will get redeployed to areas that are under pressure. So it's very difficult to reduce headcount in the public sector because there's so much demand. And, you know, the technology paradigm doesn't work as well as it would in the private sector. In the private sector, if they can get rid of 20 staff, they implement the computer system, they sack 20 staff. It's very simple. And they get sent away somewhere. They get told, here's your severance, goodbye. Because that's what drives them. Profit is what drives them. But in the public sector, it's not about profit. It's about service delivery. It's about delivering services to citizens. So it's a very different focus. And I think that sometimes doesn't come across, like particularly in IT projects, which I've done a bit of work on. A lot of project managers are so used to working in the private sector about headcount reduction and focusing on that being the main benefit. It's never the main benefit in the public sector, which is why a lot of private sector project managers don't really understand when they're doing public sector projects, they don't always get it, and they don't understand what the driver is of their particular project is. So it is a really interesting, you know, as I put up in that slide, it's a pretty different world, you know, different universes, I describe it.
They are the different motive really underlying.
Yeah, that's right. A fundamentally different construct about, even though the project discipline is quite similar, the actual reason why you're doing the project is totally different.
Yeah, maybe some more questions, because I've noticed here already discussions in the classroom kicking off. Yeah, are there questions for Paul maybe? Yeah.
So Paul, I'm attracted with the slides that you present for the project appraisal analysis that you mentioned about the financial, environmental, and social, and each stages of the appraisal. For the first is like the strategic case, the long list analysis, short list appraisal, until the monitoring. and evaluation, right?
Yeah.
So what I get from you is Pago roles in that kind of process is to monitor and evaluation about the projects, right? And then what I know, your role is to monitor after the project is finished, right? Or between the start and the process to make the project, or Fago roles is to audits after the finish. Because what I what I'm thinking of, if there's some problem, yeah, before the monitoring process, which third party to monitor the kind of process? Yeah.
So the short answer is we can audit a project at any point. So we can audit a business case, we can audit at delivery, we can audit at the end. I mean, there's nothing restricting when we do it. But I guess I put Vago there under monitoring and evaluation because that, to me, is not just, that's right throughout the life cycle. It's not very clear from this diagram, I realise. But our job is, I guess, to focus on areas of risk. So we could be looking at, like, I'll give you an example. I'll just take the slide off so you can see my face. So we have done 2 audits so far of the Metro Tunnel project. So the first audit we did was on early works, and that looked at strategic planning, early works, which was all about preparing the project. We looked at the environmental impact. So we looked at a whole bunch of stuff in that first audit. The second audit, we were looking at main works, which was the main tunnelling effort, and how they were going. And so we made some findings and recommendations around that. And the last audit, which is underway right now, we're actually looking at commissioning and testing. So as the project is coming close to going live, which maybe will be sometime next year, we're looking at all the IT testing, the train testing, the station testing. So we made a conscious decision as an organisation to look at this through 3 key points in its life cycle. Because at that point, it feels like it wasn't that long ago, it was the biggest project that had ever been approved. But Suburban Rail Loop has totally bombed that out of the water. And I mean, it was $12 billion, which was huge. But Suburban Rail Loop is probably going to be 35 billion. So the size of the projects is just immense. So the question mark for us is when should we start looking at Suburban Rail Loop? So we've looked at their business case. We'll probably have a look at their early works, maybe next year or a year after, and then we might have to look at how they're going midway through their tunnelling effort or station construction. So they're options for us. We don't always, but we also have other projects to look at. We don't want to just look at the really big ones. There's some important smaller projects. There's different sectors. So often it is a challenge for us. We don't have enough resources to look at everything. And so we have to make those strategic decisions. I don't get to make them. I can provide advice on them, but the Auditor General makes those decisions. So he sets his program every year, and we just say, "Aye, Captain," and we line up and off we go. So I hope that helped to answer. I just realised I've got actually a meeting at 4. So I'm going to have to.
Thank you, we were pushing it. I recognize this.
I can probably take one very last question, and then I have to dash for the other meeting.
Does somebody have a quick one? Quick question?
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Was it useful? Did it give you a sense of some of the stuff you're covering in your course? I mean, it's a bit hard when I'm behind the screen and you're on the other side, but is it helping you to get an understanding of the difference between the public sector and private sector decision-making processes? Yep.
Yes.
I think that's the main thing I was trying to put across to you. Is a project, but I think the consequences around, or some the techniques you use in appraisal and options development can be quite different, whether it's private sector or public sector. But anyway, good luck on your course.
A super job. You have really contextualized this. So I hope this is not for this cohort, but maybe next year I get you in person and
No, you're welcome.
be, more interactive. But yeah, thanks again, Paul. Can
All
we
right.
thank Paul for the guest talk, please?
Thank you, everyone. It was great to see you all, and good luck with the rest of your studies.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Robert. I'll send those. I'll just clean up that slide and send it across later today.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. See you, everyone. Okay.
See you.
Bye.
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 Brilliant. Thank you very much.